start. My name is and I'm the chair of the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies. Thank you all for coming. President Martin Spade taking up voice right in this important day. I'm going to be part of the conversation afterward with Lina, but I just wanted to welcome you and also introduce Alejandro Múnera, who's a PhD student in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese, who's actually the person who has organized Lina's visit today and tomorrow, and who orchestrated also asking Lina to engage this topic in particular and talk about Palestine and Palestinians in Chile when we realized the coincidence of dates. So believe it or not, it wasn't exactly planned. So I just want to thank you and thank you, Alejandro, for organizing this.
Do you hear me? Do you hear me? Okay. I am thrilled to be here with you all to introduce our guest speaker today, Chilean writer Lina Meruane. Before proceeding, I want to thank the class team, particularly Julia Bird and Carlos Alberto Gutierrez, for their help in organizing and coordinating this event. I would also like to thank Natalia Brizuela for fully supporting this idea and for revamping class into such a welcoming place to reflect and think critically alongside and through literature and the arts. I want to also thank the Arts Research Center for co-organizing and offering this wonderful space where we are today. Special thanks go to Zak Habash from Mecca, which stands for Middle East Children's Association, a non-profit humanitarian organization based in Berkeley, working to support children and families in Palestine, Iraq, and Lebanon. We encourage you all to donate to this important organization using the QR code located around the room. Today we gather to listen to Lina Meruane. She's among the most influential writers in Latin America today. Her work has been widely translated and discussed in scholarly, journalistic, and literary networks. She has received the Anna Seghers Prize, the Callum Prize, and the Order of Palestine for Culture, Science, and Arts. She has also been the recipient of numerous literary fellowships, including the Guggenheim Foundation, the National Endowment for the Arts, and the DAD Artists in Berlin program. In 2023, she was awarded the prestigious José Donoso Prize for her literary trajectory. Meruane is the author of two short story collections, Las Infantas and Avidez, Two Plays, Un Lugar Donde Caerse Muerta, and Esa Cosa Animal, and 5 novels, Póstuma and Cercada, both from 2000, Fruta Podrida from 2007, Sangre en el Ojo, which translated into English as Seeing Red and was awarded the prestigious Sor Juan Inés de la Cruz Prize in Mexico, and Sistema Nervioso from 2018. These last 3 novels delve into different forms of disease and disability. She has also written a number of genre-defying texts, including her chronicle of her Palestinian origins, Por Verse, Palestina, and the short essay book, Contra los Hijos. Among some of my all-time favorite works are Viajes Virales, La Crisis del Contagio Global, La Escritura del SIDA, Translators' Viral Voyages, Tracing AIDS in Latin America, which I believe is based on her doctoral dissertation, Zona, Ciega, a groundbreaking essay which returns to the question of vision and blindness in the context of Chile's most recent social uprising of 2019, and Palestina, por ejemplo, an extended poem where Meruane speculates alongside Virginia Woolf on what is a writer's role in the face of unrelenting war. Meruane obtained her PhD from New York University and worked for several years in the creative writing program at the same institution. As a Chilean writer of Palestinian descent, today Meruane will discuss the often unexplored linkages and affects that bind Latin America and the Caribbean with Palestinians and Palestinian resistance worldwide. Thank you, Lina, for flying thousands of miles to be with us today amid the obliteration and continued resistance of Palestinians and Gazans. Unfortunately, Professor Samera Esmeir could not be here with us today due to personal circumstances, but following Lina's talk, Natalia Brizuela, class chair and professor in the Spanish and Portuguese and Film and Media departments, and myself will engage in an open conversation with Lina. Please, everyone, join me in welcoming Lina Meruane.
Well, can you hear me?
Is it working?
Speaker on the podium. It's not coming out in the room.
I don't hear myself like speaking on a microphone, but maybe it's just subtle, and that's great.
I tried to keep it slow.
Yeah. No, then that's fine. If people can hear me,
Okay.
yeah, perfect. Okay. So let me start by saying that I feel honored to be here on this very day, 7th of October, which commemorates the massacre and kidnapping of so many Israelis and the intensification of violence and genocide in Gaza. This is, as we all know, a contentious topic to be discussed in the US and at American universities and elsewhere. I am here to discuss the history of the Palestinian diaspora in Chile, to which I belong and about which I have extensively written for more than a decade, but which inevitably will strike a chord to the present situation. An extremely sorry Palestinian professor Samera Esmeir is not here to join us today. I was really dying to meet her, but I'm also thrilled to be accompanied by my former classmate at NYU and friend, Professor Natalia Brizuela. I want to thank the class she directs, as well as Alejandro Múnera, who made this invitation not only possible, but a delightful one. Back to Alejandro. And thank you all for being here today. The title of my talk, as you can see, is Chilestineans, Notes on Migration, Assimilation, and the Myth of a Palestinian reawakening in Chile. To see how I do this on both hands. I'm a lefty, so it's not. A journalist asked Ben Gurion, founder of the State of Israel, as well as the first Prime Minister, what would happen to the Palestinians. His reply was that the old would die and the young would forget. But the young have not forgotten. They will never forget. These words are by Nicola Hadwa, a member, a trainer, from the Deportivo Palestino, which is a very well-known soccer club, not only for its soccer, which is not so good, apparently, I'm not a soccer person, but because of what they do also politically to keep not only the memory, but also the flag and all the iconography of Palestinianness alive. So let's start. 1. Years ago in New York, as I was going through my Palestinian travel notes, years ago, as I began writing down the trip I had made to Palestine, as I wrote about knowing so little about my grandparents' migration from Bejala to Chile, their making of home away from home. Years ago, a decade or so, as I interrogated my father trying to understand my own lack of understanding. Years ago, indeed, the words assimilation, integration, and forgetting made sense to me. It seemed possible, I pondered, that those Palestinian migrants, mostly Christian Palestinians, who had abandoned their lands in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, escaping discrimination and compulsory military service, as well as the shortages, starvation, and epidemics brought on by political instability and wars under the harsh rule of the Ottoman Empire, that those Palestinians who later left their friends and families under the 30 years long British mandate, who were forced to leave when in 1948 their territories were ceded to the state of Israel and terrible wars ensued, it was possible, I repeat, that all those Palestinians had renounced their identity. It seemed conceivable, even believable, that they had wanted to establish themselves and never look back, never return. But let me stay with the pioneering Palestinians of the early 20th century, among which were my grandparents and their siblings and cousins. Actually, this is a picture of my very, very early Chilean Palestinian family. It's the store that they had in a town called Chilestineans. They had heard of America due to the growing international commerce of Holy Land products, olive wood, mother of pearl, Nabi Moses stone, and thus deemed the Americas a prosperous land for merchants, which is what Palestinians were to become. They tried countries like Cuba in the Caribbean, and Honduras or El Salvador in Central America, and Mexico and Brazil, Paraguay, Peru, and in even larger numbers, Chile. Let me just footnote some figures here, because of course you will, I guess, want to know. According to scholar Wael Hassan, Brazil is today home to the largest community of Arab descent in the Americas, an estimate of 7 to 12 million, or 3.5 to 6% of the population. While in Spanish America, Argentina has an Arab descent of about 4.5 million. Estimates are that the early wave of Palestinian immigrants to the Americas reached 500,000, the highest number of Palestinians being in Chile, while the highest percentage is considered to be in Honduras, where they make up 3% of the population. Currently, Chile has the biggest Palestinian diaspora community outside the Arab world. In addition, the majority of Palestinian Christians live today outside of Palestine. There's a saying in Spanish that for every village in Chile, you will find three things: a policeman, a pastor, and a Palestinian. A version of the saying is taken up by Palestinian U.S. historian Rashid Khalili, whose son lives in Chile. In every town, there is a Palestinian major, a deputy, and a football player. This is a very unique situation. This might be a slight exaggeration if he means that all three are of Palestinian descent. But for sure, in the Palestinian town where my father grew up, San Felipe, near the Andes, those three influential professionals would be Palestinian. So let me return to my narrative. In none of those places that I just mentioned were Palestinians greeted, but they were not rejected either, as they had been in the United States, where between 1917 and 1924, the U.S. law limited immigration of non-Anglo-Saxons, aiming to preserve a white ethnic hegemony. In an analogous racist line of thinking, Latin American Criollo elites, direct descendants of the Spanish and the Portuguese, welcomed all migration that would help whiten out the black and indigenous lineages. Arabs and Jews were certainly frowned upon, as they had been in Spain before the expulsion and/or conversion in 1492. However, because of the long centuries of proximity and racial mixing in Europe, both Arabs and Jews looked like the Criollos, or vice versa, and thus it was not entirely clear to the Criollos, the Latin American Criollos, whether Middle Eastern truly qualified as non-whites. This is, I find that really fascinating. Whiteness, as Eric Beckman has noted, was a racial category that went far beyond phenotype to vouch for the virility, morality, and discipline of a homogenized national race. Arabs and Jews were indeed known for their morality and their work ethic. Perhaps for this reason, Latin American governments gave them the benefit of the doubt and allowed them to move in, but made sure to grant only white Europeans migratory incentives that Arabs and Jews were never entitled to. Not rejected, but not rooted. I just said this, but it is an understatement. For decades, they were despised everywhere. As Antonia Rebolledo has claimed, prejudice was particularly intense in the upper classes. Their racism was voiced without qualms by El Mercurio, one of the oldest daily newspapers in Chile. In 1911, the conservative Mercurio, which would later openly support the Chilean dictatorship, published an unsigned op-ed on the opening page complaining about the indolence and lack of oversight regarding the dangerous Arab migrants. Whether they are Mohammedans, read Muslim, or Buddhists, read Asian, what is seen and smelled from afar is that they are all dirtier than the dogs of Constantinople. Read today's Istanbul, read Turkey, read Turks. And they enter and leave the country with the freedom of those same dogs that those same dogs enjoy in theirs. No one asks them who they are, where they come from, or where they are going. No one even checks whether or not they bring some of those horrible and mysterious plagues of the East. And this is how all the plagues that we suffer at the present moment have entered Chile through the great way of our ignorance. There's nothing to spare in this quote. 3. Not knowing the native language or speaking it with an accent, not understanding yet the social codes of the new land, with customs alien to the locals. Arabs were ordered and given derogatory names. This is, by the way, my great-grandmother? Great-grandmother?
Great-great-grandmother.
Yeah, so something like that. Very old. I didn't get me. So Arabs were, not understanding yet the social codes of the new land, with customs alien to the locals. Arabs were othered and given derogatory names. Turcos, Turks, was the misnomer they received because until 1918, which is when the first wave of Levantine migration paused, their passports were issued by the Ottomans. Of course, the use of Turco ignored the distinction between Middle Eastern peoples, Arabs, Armenians, Syrian Jews, Persians, Greeks, and of course, Turks. And to add insult to injury, Turco was the name of the empire the Arabs were fleeing. As things were not easy, as they seldom are for migrants, they made their best to pass unnoticed. They silenced the narrative of their origin to the outside world. They translated their names into Spanish equivalents. My grandfather, Isa, or Jesus, became Salvador. His brothers, rhyming Jadala and Natala, turned into Natalio and Alberto. My grandmother, Milade, became Maria, and so on. They toned down their surnames unless immigration officials had already done so at the entry point. Meruane became Meruane, Tape, the very Chilean Tapia, and so on and so forth. There's even Núñez and Martínez were actually Arabs. They swayed from the Greek Orthodox Church to the Orthodox Church of Antioch to the Roman Catholic Church. They earned money as merchants and had their children educated in the public system, still free, still of excellence by them. actually wanted to show you, oh, sorry. So this is my dad is somewhere here, here, right? He got a really good public education and then went to the University of Chile that at that point was also free. He studied medicine and is now a very well-situated 80-something year old man. Maybe you can recognize him here. But what I was interested in this picture is that he's not the darkest in the group, right? The professor even seems to me looks more Arab than anybody else. But it's interesting. I'll just show you who he is. I think at that age I looked very much like him. Anyway, but I wanted just to show you. This is also a little bit of ethnography. So these Arabs and their children, who were 100% Arabs, 100% Palestinians, they married outside of the community so they would fully integrate. In the meantime, most lost their tongue. Much attention has been placed upon the fact that Palestinians quickly learned the tongue of the new land and that Palestinians ceased to speak their own to their children. That they stopped speaking Arabic even to themselves. That Arabic would only come out in dreams. And indeed, this is the story of my elders. My grandmother had arrived to Chile as a young girl, my grandfather in 1920 at the probable age of 15. By the time they met in Chile, both were fluent in Spanish. My grandfather never got rid of his accent, but made sure not to pass it along. Already in the 1940s, the community was losing the ability to even understand the language of origin. But I ask myself now, what exactly did this language of origin mean by then to my grandmother, who had learned to read and write in Spanish? My grandmother, who felt a stranger in Arabic and who couldn't speak it to her children. What did she consider her mother tongue to be? Or to bring this question closer to Silvia Molloy's phrasing, whose origin was conveyed in the use of the word origin? My contention here is that by stressing the notion of linguistic loss, the narrative of migration in fact conceals more than it explains. It reinforces the idea that the uprooting from a land and a language signified the utter destruction of a cultural identity. As if the language of origin was the single component of cultural identity and its absence was enough proof that the destructive force of assimilation, once supplemented, would be irreversible. But this idea of assimilation, destructive and successful only if destructive, belongs to the persuasive, however reductive and self-interested, nationalist rationale that was in trend in Latin American historiography throughout the past century. It was very much in tone with the nationalist fantasy of racial homogeneity, which I fear was somewhat better than the exclusionary racial othering we are facing today. In that model, national identity was seen as a fixed reality, as a stable, homogeneous construct that welcomed strangers only if they were able to leave their cultures behind. A model, the nationalist, astray from the way we now understand identities to be. Not the possession of a set of stable characteristics, but the engagement in social practices and interactions. The heterogeneous, unstable, irreducible, and always in flux making of political subjectivities. Since the 1980s, contemporary social thinkers, James Clifford et al., began complicating the understanding of cultural identity as a process rather than as an essence, made up by a multiplicity of components which may at times exist in a drowsy latency until they are activated, usually in response to a current event that threatens its survival. Because, to paraphrase Silvia Spita, who has critically studied transculturation processes in colonial Latin America, the stronger the assimilation process, the stronger too will be the reaction to cultural erasure. Culture, in other words, is extremely resilient and responds to the desire of erasure. It gains strength precisely when it is attacked, endangered, denied, as Palestinian identity was. So in truth, they did not commit to disappear. Against all odds, they knit together a strong community which, rather than fix its identity to a language, or to a clothes, or even to a food, relied on other linguistic tools in the production of their cohesion. One of those instruments was sports, to which I will return later. The other was written media. Palestinians joined to celebrate or discuss social and political dilemmas in a surprising number of periodicals and magazines, some written entirely in Arabic and some bilingual. So you will see here the list of a number of periodicals, which I will translate because my Arabic is inconsistent and I cannot pronounce as well. But the Guide, Emotions, The Torch, Youth, The Fatherland, East and West, and The Reformation. You can see that there's plenty of those, and they're actually not such large communities. The content of these periodicals suggests that Arabic migrants in Chile actively connected with others, regionally, locally, regionally, and transnationally, to defend the economic well-being and social reputation of their hayila, which is immigrant community, and to demand their rights, suggests contemporary Middle Eastern historian Nadine Bawaza. No matter in what language these newspapers, Nadine Bawaza argues, played a critical role in the transformation of temporal migrants into an established diaspora. I want to say something about the word diaspora, which maybe some of you know and some of you don't. But diaspora is not the mere immigrant community. As French geographer Emmanuel Mamoun has noted, a diaspora contains several generations and a multipolar dispersion as well as interpolarity of relations between the various parts of the diaspora. In the context of this discussion, such a dynamic perspective is more useful than the rigid reification that characterizes diasporas as ethnic groups with exact frontiers. So I will rather use diaspora than migrants, right? Because that's the way all Latin American Arab communities are, right? They're mixed, they're multi-generational, they relate to each other, so they don't fix to a certain territory or frontiers. Even when Arabic was completely replaced by Spanish in Oriente, the East, and Mundo Árabe, Arab world, these are other periodicals, and even while the Palestinians intended to settle definitively in their host countries, the already formed Palestinian diaspora increasingly claimed its belonging to the Palestinian nation. 4. The fantasy or the phantom of a successful assimilation and integration process also provided for decades an interpretative framework as to why so many Palestinian migrants postponed or disregarded a return to their cities, to their villages, to their homes, even before 1948, when their return was outlawed by the Israeli state. Present historical findings show, however, to what extent this is an incomplete version of a complex reality. There were, to be sure, decisive political impediments which were widely discussed in the Palestinian media in Chile and elsewhere. After the fall of the Ottoman Empire, thousands, in fact, had decided to go back home. only to find that the British authorities had closed the doors of Palestine in their faces. This is perhaps not the place to discuss the specifics of the Palestinian citizenship law ratified in 1925, following the contentious pro-Jewish Balfour Declaration of 1917, which denied Palestinians their right of return and their nationality while facilitating citizenship to the arriving Jewish European immigrants. It is worth knowing, though, that this reinvention of citizenship not only defied international treaties, but was unlike anything Great Britain had done throughout its colonial empire, writes Palestinian historian Adam Musalam. In a few years, that British conceived citizenship law disenfranchised some 10,000 Palestinians and provoked uprisings in protest of such restrictions. What I find more striking, but surely not at all surprising, is that the British mandate deemed all Arabs not only as former Ottoman citizens, but as ethnically Turkish. Purposely or not, I am inclined to suspect this was truly convenient, the British chose to misread ethnic and cultural differences and saw in returning Palestinians undeserving foreigners, the paradox being here of the British for foreigners themselves. The most foreign of all, actually, if such a thing can be said of any one group in the most cultural Levant. Still, this gave the British a reason to deny Palestinians the historic ownership of their land and, even worse, established a legal precedent that lasts until today. The lack of both ownership and citizenship in Palestine immensely complicated not only the lives of the returning Palestinians, but also the well-being of the Palestinians in the diaspora. It placed a hold in their migratory status, in their international travel, in their application for new citizenship in the Latin American nations, which Palestinians were compelled to request since they now had no better options. My grandfather, to reference my family once more in this autoethnography of sorts, applied for and was granted Chilean citizenship in 1936. I was actually so interested to find this. It was actually put in a frame and held in my grandfather's home. I think as a sort of a grounding of his own unfulfilled return. He never went back. This British aggression, contested everywhere, challenged the diaspora to take a position in the events back in Palestine. Likewise, it had the effect of strengthening abroad the sense of Palestinianness. 5. I began the conference by stating that I was too easily persuaded by the assimilationist narrative of a forgetting that was my own, as well as of a late awakening that was also mine. It took me some time and much reading to understand that my upbringing in isolation from both the Palestinian and the Chilestinian community was not representative of the community at large. More often than not, now I know, one should avoid assuming that the story of one family or a few is the experience of them all. Let me clarify that we, the Meruanes, did not live amongst the lower class merchants of the Patronato neighborhood, and neither did we belong to the fancy Palestino social club where the Turco-Nouveau riches mingled since 1948. My brothers and I did not attend the Colegio Árabe because by 1978, the year the Arab school was founded, we were already placed in another institution where we and other students were sometimes called Turcos. And because I did not study in the emblematic Universidad de Chile, I never heard of the Center of Arab Culture which had opened in 1966, nor joined the UJEP, the General Union of Palestinian Students, that since the mid-1980s worked towards the creation of a Palestinian state. I had listened to plenty of romanticized family stories and ate on weekends Palestinian dishes prepared by a non-Palestinian cook. But I had almost entirely missed out of the Chilestineans, as the Palestinian diaspora dubbed itself. How was this possible in Chile, which was and continues to be the country with the largest, best organized, and most active group of individuals of Palestinian descent working on the question of Palestine? How, in a nation which, at the onset of the 21st century, began the process of professionalizing the pro-Palestinian movement? What might explain my family's total disengagement with politics was the Chilean dictatorship in which I grew up. Allow me to speak frankly. Throughout the 1970s, the Chilestinians would become politically at odds. And this is also one of the reasons. With the upper class members of the community fiercely organizing against the social regime that had nationalized their industries, mostly textiles, and the working class paisanos organized against the capitalist right-wing dictatorship that took over in 1973 with U.S. backing. Those were years in which economic neoliberal policies were cruelly applied, the years in which the Chilestinian community suffered a widening economic gap. That the Palestine Liberation Organization, the OLP, under Yasser Arafat, and the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, headed by George Abbas, had assumed an anti-imperialist and an anti-capitalist position made local politics even more acrimonious. Only violence against Palestinians at the Samera and Shatila refugee camps in 1982 would bring the community back together. The slaughter of hundreds of Palestinian Muslims in the camps south of Lebanon, carried out by Lebanese Maronite Christians while overseen by the Israeli Defense Forces, provoked an emotion that transcended the community's earlier divisions and in Chile fostered the first demonstration of unity amongst Palestinians. A sense of unity and strength that persists, a sense of unity only intensified in successive intensifications of the Palestinian oppression. Not coincidentally, it is with a mourning scene honoring the Samera and Shatila victims that a contemporary Chilean documentary called For Color begins. This is one of the moments of the beginning of this film, which is interesting. If you read carefully, the quote used by the non-Chilestinian director, Aldo Guerrero, does not mention the women or the children who were slaughtered in the camps, which were many, because as in every Palestinian town, there's, well, at least half are women and mostly their children because the elder could not survive. So, not the women and not the children who were slaughtered in the camp, but rather the resistant fighters that were said to have been hiding there, the men who died defending their right to have a homeland. Contrary to what that political charge opening might suggest, together with the evocation of the Palestinian flag in the film's title, Four Colors, the film is neither a documentary about the Samera and Shatila massacre, nor about the ongoing Palestinian struggles. It's a film about Chilean soccer, a Chilean soccer team, the Deportivo Palestino, whose story is punctuated by the history of the Chilestinian response to critical events in both of their homes, in both places of origin. As the documentary unfolds, we learn that the Palestino Sportivo Club, which is another name, was founded first as a tennis club in 1916 to work against Arab stereotyping and ethnic discrimination, the Turcophobia. It was reestablished, the club, as a soccer team in 1920 after the Balfour Declaration of 1917, and coinciding with, as well as responding to, the establishment of the British Mandate in 1920, when at least, when, as already said, the future of Palestinians was to be decided. Deportivo Palestino's last incarnation as a professional football team occurred in the immediacy of the partition of 1948. The professionalization of Palestino came after the MAPA, not before, notes on camera Ilan Pape, who was interviewed in this film, a respected revisionist historian. While lecturing in Chile, invited by the Palestino Social Club, created in 1948, Pape adds that the impulse to relaunch the team was an effect of the Palestinian catastrophe, because, he claims, in 1948, everyone thought that a Palestine wasn't right. I know that there's lots of echoes here. The story repeats. When the problem started, se está pasando solo. Oh, no. Okay. Okay, anyway. I'll just get that. When, no, actually no. Si salgo está como mal programado. Bueno, voy a cerrarlo porque si no me distrae mucho. Okay. When the problem started in Palestine, we wanted to create a team and name it Palestino, so people would know us, Palestinians, recounts Carlos Facun, a member of the first professional team in Cuatro Colores. Soon after Palestino's president received, it's interesting also to note that soon after the creation of this team, the soccer team, Palestino's president received an offer of $200,000 in that time from the Jewish community in Chile to change the team's name from Palestino to Arab, in line with the erasure that was part of the Israeli politics ever since, and which I have delved into in my books that will not go over now. In 1982, the 1982 massacre is yet another catastrophe where the community voices its indignation and its pain. In Spanish, on the TV screen, and the newspaper titles through the persona of its well-known players. There is more to Palestino than its games, more even than winning or losing a match. It is what it represents, the reality of Palestine, its political present and its future. The Palestinians' cause outside Palestine and the Palestinian flag, forbidden elsewhere, promotes the Palestinian territories, green, white, black, and red colors, says one contemporary player on screen. To come back to my point and begin to include, the public presence of Palestino as a Chilean football club is determined by significant political events in Palestine, or in the refugee camps beside it, crammed with Palestinians. In other words, Palestino's trajectory reveals that against the official narrative produced in Chile and internalized by the Palestinian community, against the nationalist narrative of exclusionary identities, integration occurred without the destructive form of assimilation described before. Palestinians became Chileans while maintaining their otherness, and without ever experiencing the need to wear a composite identity. It simply fused into a Chilestinianness that kept both identities, both loyalties. This is what is impressively documented in 4 colors. So to give another example, already in the mid-20th century, not all players were members of the diaspora. Some were called Zacarías, Atala, Abu Hamor, Hasbun, Islami, Yirmas, and so on, and others had recognizable Chilean surnames, Miranda, Toro, Fernandez. Indicating who is who in old photographs and yellow newspapers, one Palestino founder explains to the camera this name variation with noticeable uncertainty. They probably had Arab mothers too, he says. Watching him speak, one can deduce that both the absence of Arabic as well as the mix of Arab and Spanish names did not make much of a difference then, and continued not to matter when non-Chilestineans joined the team and assumed its uniform and its political cause. Those other Chileans, and an Argentinian, and a player born and raised in Palestine had created a community of political and emotional affinities. And to be sure, even Aldo Guerrero, the non-Chilestinian director of the cited documentary, has taken upon himself to narrate what it means to be a Palestino player. In closing, let me raise the final claim. The Chilestinian case shows that open forms of identification and multiple belongings are possible within the national framework, and therefore challenges essentialist narratives of identity, so dangerously in vogue today, with its call to one language, one race, one faith, and the mandate to make the other within us disappear. So, many thanks.
So Alejandro and I are going to engage Lina in some questions, but then we're going to open it up so that everyone gets a chance to ask questions as well. And I think it's supposed to be
Yes. Thank you very much, Lina, for the talk. I kept thinking how this relates to debating ethnic studies and queer theory, thinking about identity, but also identity beyond borders. And I was thinking how you also privilege not only game and sports as a way of resisting that exclusionary framework, but also written media like periodicals and journalist pieces that establish this community or this imagined community in the diaspora. I was curious to hear more about how you see your own writing practice in as participating in this joy, in this forms of joy and transformation that go against identity understood as something fixed, or something immutable, right? And how you're experimenting with genre, because I know you come from journalism, but when you write these chronicles like Roberto Palestina, you do a kind of montage, you do a different kind of approach to your own origins in plural. And so how do you see not only written practice as consolidating a Palestinian identity in the diaspora, but also your own writing practice? How does that work?
Thank you very much. Such a beautiful question. So yes, it's media, sports, and I think what's missing in this piece is food.
Yes.
Which is also important, but I wouldn't extend eternally on the many factors of sort of that keeping the culture alive while mixing it, right? So my own writing practice, I really didn't think of this connection that you're making, and I think it's interesting because in fact my own practice is very hybrid. I have never really stopped myself from, like, within a genre, which is another form of frontier, at least as they would define in the 20th century. So I've never restricted myself in genre, and I've never resisted contamination. I am actually quite interested in not only sort of fusing genres and using whatever is useful in the writing, and sort of and mixing form, but also sort of thinking of writing as a sort of context book, right? And especially, my Palestinian books comes later, but in my previous book already there was a segregation. Already I was trying to think about how to include other languages that are present in my own world. And so when I wrote my Palestinian chronicle, which really, or essay or memoir, or I know it's all of those things, I was already kind of in this trend of bringing in all sorts of materials and thinking of a context zone and how to represent that place, which is really infiltrated by so many cultures. And is also marked by the presence of so many languages, right? So that became very important and became one of the questions I also had about my own writing. So one of the things, just to give an example, was the question of language, right? It's a book that I write in Spanish, but most of it occurs in a place where Arabic and Hebrew are spoken. But then what is the language in which people, foreigners, communicate in English? But then I thought, oh, but then English is very problematic here because we're assuming that this is a language that we're all going to turn to, right? But where are the other languages that are heard in this place? I had no Arabic, I had no Hebrew, I had no French, no German. And so suddenly I started rethinking the whole question of language and bringing all these words, sometimes translated and sometimes not translated, into the text and see what happens. And in fact, what happens with this book that I wrote over 10 years is that it begins with the notion of loss and return, but then it kind of moves into the recovery of all those things lost. And one of them is language. So while the first part of the book is all in Spanish, it ends up being written in Arabic. In many languages and then Arabic. But at the very end, the Arabic is not transliterated, but it's actually written in Arabic, which is of course a problem for the editor, because when you move words to design, it turns around in Arabic. You need to be really careful. I had to check like 100 times the book so it was written in Arabic, because Arabic is written in the other direction. So coming back to the question of hybridity, so how to represent this instability of cultural markers, languages, physiognomy, clothing, and all of these things is what actually I brought into the writing.
Thank you for that very generative and generous presentation. I was wondering if you could talk about, at one point you mentioned, and in a footnote that I read the talk before, you have presented it, the long footnote where you go into some detail about the three waves, right? Three large waves of migration from Palestine, of all Palestinians, to Chile. Under the Ottoman Empire, from 1860 to 1916, under the British Mandate, 1918 to 1948, and after Nakba. And I was wondering if you had noticed in your studies and in your delving not only into your own personal archive, your travels to Palestine, but also kind of later age recognition that there had actually been like a multiplicity of being Palestinian in Chile experiences. If you had noticed kind of shift at any of those moments, meaning there's three big waves of migration, and there's things change in the diasporic life. I mean, was there something different? It seemed like a lot of the newspapers, at least the ones you mentioned here in the slide, were from like 1912, right? So like end of the Ottoman Empire, and during the British Mandate, there seemed to be a kind of increase, one could also just trace it to the fact of the rise in print media, right? But if these forms of diasporic life, they change with every wave of migration. There's something different that is congealing, right? I mean, so
soccer club is born early, but it reemerges in the 80s, right, with a new purpose, right? It's like it's diasporic exercise is a different one.
Yes. Thank you for that later question. So it's a really interesting question actually, because the very early wave of migrations that occurred under the Ottoman Empire responded to a political context. There was the fact that the Christian Palestinians and the Christian Arabs, more generally speaking, that were under this occupation, were having a really hard time, right, because of the Christians. And so the reason why they moved out is because, one, starvation, economic difficulties, mistreatment from the Turks, who were not the harshest, right? They were more open with other religions, but still. And because the Palestinian boys and young men were being sent to war, and this is a time of war, right? This is when they moved out. So, for example, things like the fact that the men were usually baptized like 6 years after they were born, just because they wanted to inscribe a different date of birth so that they wouldn't be sent so early to war if they had to go. That's the fact of my grandfather, who didn't know really when he was born. And then the church burned, and they never found out what age he was really, right? And so these things were happening in this sort of context, under the Ottomans, the Christians having difficulties, having to go to war, and then putting their families to the Americas, right? So that was a very long and continued process until the end of the First World War, as I mentioned. Under the British, there wasn't so much migration, but the problem is that, as I mentioned, they couldn't really return. Many of them wanted to return, they wouldn't be allowed to return. And that's something that has been obscured in history. I mean, for many years I couldn't find out this part of the story. So that isn't a time of much migration. And then the Nakba occurs, and that's a very different group of people, because and they're coming with a different form of pain, right? Because many of them moved out of Palestine to refugee camps in Jordan, Lebanon, and then elsewhere, right? But the kind of pain and the kind of struggles they were going through, and the kind of leaving homes behind was not only of less privileged Palestinians, but also there were a lot of very well-established Palestinian families that went left with their keys thinking they would return to peace and never could. Right? So that is, I think, a sort of a different, more mixed group of people, both in terms of their religious faith and also of their social and economic position back in the land. And then in 1967,
and they arrived in after 48, and they speak Arabic.
And they speak Arabic. And the other thing is that, yes,
there might be almost like 80 years between one wave or 60 years
correct,
where they start losing their Arabic, then there's this
influx.
Yeah.
Yes. The other interesting thing, just to spend a minute on Christian language, is that the migration from the Christians versus the Muslims was different in terms of language, because the Muslims read the Quran and pray with the Quran, right? So that kept the Arabic alive, right? Even if it was not spoken regularly at home, or even if they would speak it on the street in public life, Arabic was a more resonant and current language, at least at home and in their religious practices. So it was easier for the Christians, for the early Christians, to lose language than later migrants, like in 48, 67, which is the next big war, and even the migrants, the people who went into refugee camps in Syria, for example, and then Syria was in war, and then they came to Chile. That was a very different sort of people. Those came from migration, from refugee camps, right? So there is a little bit of a difference, and also the later Palestinians who arrived found that the earlier Palestinians did not necessarily want to be so they were not so comfortable with the new migrants, right? Because they had already established themselves and gone up the economic ladder, right? So lots of complexities. What I do find interesting today is that a lot of the descendants of Palestinians are learning Arabic, right? They're more and more interested in sort of taking back the loss, right? Recovering what was lost in those conversations. But I think that also that is happening not only in the Arab communities, but also in other communities. What I find surprising is that my book somehow resonates with a lot of people of other communities, because that's also the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century was a time of migration for Italians, Croatians, Jews from different parts of Europe, Germans, right? And so there is a sort of moment of coming back to the origins that people somehow become more interested in what their grandparents wanted to silence.
Before I give the question back to Alejandro, also you help me also understand something that becomes evident in your talk, which is that you make a point of recuperating and stressing the term diaspora versus immigration or migrant, right? And in the diasporic tradition, such as you have shown it in the case of Palestinians in Chile, it is about being in more than one place at the same time. Because what seems to mobilize the communities that might be radically left on the political spectrum, radically right, is anything that touches what we could call the Palestinian condition. And that brings them together, right? And particularly after 82, if I understood correctly, right? And so suddenly, and so then it's like the moment when you can start thinking that, you know, the very category of the immigrants belongs to a historical moment, and that thinking of oneself as a diasporic subject means that you can be in more than one place at the same time. And hence you will recuperate. You will go back and learn Arabic that maybe hadn't been spoken in your family for 4 generations and 5 generations, you know? And I think we are, for numerous reasons, at a historical moment where both politically, socially, we understand identity as something much more mobile, right, and in movement. And so to reclaim the diasporic, or to think of oneself as diasporic, is like, oh, I can be Chilean and I can also be Palestinian. The fact that Arabic was not spoken in my family for 5 generations or 4 generations doesn't mean I cannot claim that and be a Palestinian in Chile, you know. It also takes us to questioning, like, what is nationality? Like that is not, it's not even the term, right?
Yeah, but what is very interesting to me is that, while I agree completely with what you have said, when you go to a place like Palestine, which has no nation, which has no political representation, I mean, it has a political representation, but it doesn't function as a state. It has no rights as a state, and no international rights. So when you go there, they immediately ask you, why is it that you don't speak Arabic? Right? And also, they're kind of almost offended by the fact that you don't, right? And they struggle to think about diaspora in the way that we're doing, right? Because it's a comfortable way of thinking as well, and it's a privilege. It's a privilege to be able to think of oneself as sort of inhabiting many realities and existence, right? So they are much more framed by the need of a state, the need of frontiers, the need of security, the need of rights. And that also brings me to an anecdotal moment that was very telling to me, which was I was in Germany at a conference with a lot of Palestinian scholars. It was about Palestine. And I was talking about my book that was originally called Becoming Palestine, or Becoming Palestinian. It had like ambiguity inside of it. And one of the scholars stood up and said, you cannot become Palestinian. You are not Palestinian. Because, and And I thought he was going to say because you don't speak Arabic. And he said, because you haven't had the Palestinian experience of suffering. Which was, I was kind of blanked out by this comment. Because it's not the usual comment. And this is an actual impression. But then another professor, also a Palestinian, stood up and she said, and she completely undid his argument and said, well, diaspora is also an effect of the Palestinian history and the suffering of Palestinians since they cannot return. So she is entitled to that part of the Palestinian suffering. Although I don't feel myself as I feel very privileged. I don't feel that I've gone through such pains as Palestinians there. And then she also said, and defining a culture, defining a community, defining an identity through pain is the worst we can do to our community. Because we are constructing a community through loss, not through all the other elements that make us a community and a culture.
And just to bring Samera, who can't be here today, who was supposed to be leading this conversation with Lina, you know, through my friendship and my collaboration with Samera, I came to learn of the term sumud, right, which is steadfastness, to remain, right? And of course, that term, which is central to Palestinianness, right, is primarily linked to the question of land, to stay, you must stay, right? But it's interesting to think, like, would it be possible to think of that term also conceptually, like, to remain Palestinian? Maybe it's not becoming, but to remain Palestinian, according to the debate you just shared with us that happened in Germany.
It's a very beautiful idea, but one can only claim what one feels is right to claim, right? So remaining Palestinian would be a difficult word for me to have, because even returning to Palestine felt like I was returning in the name of somebody else, right? Just to tell you the beginning of the book has to do with my travel to my first trip to Palestine, and I was telling everybody that I was going to Palestine, which I had not really thought about before. And every time I said, I wanted to say I am visiting Palestine for the first time, but I would say I am returning to Palestine. And this happened over and over again, like a really strong thing that was coming without me thinking. And I actually told Lina Meruane, our dear late professor, I don't know why this is happening to me. I'm saying return when I've never been there. And she said, yes, you're returning as a mandate from your ancestors. Oh, that's so true. So this is the sort of the part of me trying to put together this sort of family history, the mandates that are there. But the mandates were not to remain since they left, but more like to return, right? And to become in a way that is not, become in the way of not in the way of staying, but in the way of affiliating politically to the cause. So I think, but I do think that this idea of to move, to stay, can also be not only, it could be also in the affection. Staying close to Palestinians.
Well, the stalker. Many moments in life.
Yes.
There were it was not only Chilestineans, the sufferer.
Well, this is the sort of the political force of the team is precisely that they have not only incorporated people who do not have any connection and then converted them into Palestinians, but also because they have a large stadium in a very popular area of Santiago. And so a lot of people who attend the games at this particular stadium have become more and more aware of the Palestinian issue. And they're very supportive of the cause. It's really interesting. My husband bought himself a Palestinian t-shirt, right? And that Palestinian t-shirt was a very contentious one. I'll explain in a minute. But every time we go to the open air market to get our vegetables, the caseros say, Dino, Palestino, right? There's something very interesting there, which has been that the idea of founding a soccer team to erase the stereotyping and make people friendlier to the Palestinians has actually worked in time and has worked in popular areas of Santiago too. Not only like in upper class or groups, right? But also like in general public areas. And I was just going to say that the contentiousness of that T-shirt is that it recovered the historic Palestinian map and turned it sort of equivalent to the number 1, right? And so that was forbidden by the FIFA. You cannot have the historic map, and then the Palestinian team said, well, we can, because we were founded before Israel was founded. So, you know, all these really complex situations, and so it was, the T-shirt was forbidden. But then the players came to the games with it was tattooed in their arms. So they will stand up and do like this, right? So it's interesting in the symbolic level, right? What you do with prohibition and remaining or becoming, right? And how you demonstrate that in such different ways. The thing is that T-shirt still is sold. So they can play with the T-shirt, but it's still sold. So in the last March, 3 days ago in Santiago, 2 days ago in Santiago, a lot of people were wearing that T-shirt. Yeah. Anyway, I just, me fui de la deriva, pero you know what I mean. Yeah. It's interesting how affiliations with cultures and causes work over time. That's what I wanted to illustrate.
And before we open it up for everyone, I just wanted everyone to get a glimpse of the kind of thinking that traverses the work around certain issues that are not only they're not talked about, they're hidden, they are suppressed from discourse, and that goes back to your cultural education on AIDS. It goes through your books around illness and disability, and I just wanted you to tell us a little bit more about what guiding threat you see around your work, and that connects all these issues that have to do with suppression, elimination of liberation, with an ending of that process that you kind of work through by highlighting the body alone. I think the ill body, the body in movement. So I just wanted you to
Yes, I fear you answered the question. Which was a question that I really struggled with as a young PhD student, because I had all these, like, I thought, oh, this part of my brain writes fiction, and this other part of my brain tries to be a scholar at that time. And as I continued to write, I thought, how do I put all this sort of different, these themes that apparently are different, right? My interest in feminism and maternity on one side, disease as a very important problem in my work, but then also the movement of the AIDS community, the queer community that marry in and out of their own restrictive nations, right? And then, you know, all sorts of other things that have sort of popped up in my writing because I'm interested in. And as you said, I think that one of the sort of threads there is the question of survival, really. The really material question of the body's survival, right? How have women survived all the difficulties, and how they found strength, right, to overcome such prohibitions for such long centuries, or how have the AIDS patients, right, claimed their right to be taken care of by the states, right, which had formerly tried to get rid of them. And what's going on with the Palestinian situation, right, and the actual genocide that is going on. I mean, it's interesting that I go back to the book and they seem to be so contemporary. Right? But there is something that I think I've been very worried about or thinking about is vulnerability survival, community making, how to live together. All those themes that can thread all these things that appear in my work.
So if there's anyone who would like to participate with a question or a comment, we'd be glad to have you participate. Yes?
Yes. You want to stand up and if you're able to, and so you can project. Yeah.
Okay, so first of all, I have to read a couple minutes. That's my purpose, so I'll be quick. Thank you so much for this talk. Migrated, which I think she's my message for And so I guess not to bring myself into it, but I'm descended from, on my grandmother's side from Syrian Argentines. And so learning about like all of this and the way that like, you know, my family processes and is constructed through these like horrifically violent, like, you know, and contemporary historical traumas is like, you know, really like rewiring my brain chemistry. So I'm really asking myself, like, I think that there's a tendency within my elders to want to erase. I'm really struck by what you said about like recuperating and finding the other in yourself. I get the sense that my elders and many other elders and the people around me want to continue erasing and facing that other in themselves. So I'm wondering, is there a utility to helping to reminding our others of that, or our elders of that other? And if so, what is it? How can we access it? Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much for that question. Yes, it's true that, I mean, there's a lot of people from the older generations that suffer discrimination, therefore they have also sort of discriminated that other in themselves, right? And that's something very well described as a psychological process, right? Which is very hard to undo. I actually have a student, a grade writing student, who is Hungarian, and she's having a struggle with her father because she's writing about activism today, right, of the Palestinian community, of the Palestinians community. And she goes back to her father often and asks him questions, and he's just trying to not answer the questions, or always says that he doesn't know, he doesn't remember. But throughout the time, it's been interesting to read on her process of writing. The father has suddenly become interested in helping her. I think there's a sort of pride that this daughter, right, has become so affectionate to this part of the past that was denied, as if she is validating the people they are and where they came from. And that validation is working as a sort of healing tool against that discrimination that those earlier elders suffered. Sorry, my English is so rusty. I haven't been doing anything for such a long time. Anyway, but I think that there's something about the pain and the ways in which that can be overcome and healed. And storytelling, I don't want to sound very esoteric here, but storytelling has a function in these family issues and pains and struggles. I unfortunately didn't get to be old enough to talk to my grandparents about this, so I don't really know exactly, but I do know that my grandparents did not deny their identity. They just sort of adapted by doing whatever was required from them. But I do know that there's parts of these communities, and the more discriminated, the worse. Or even when you're not discriminated yourself, you see others of the community being discriminated. You reject that identity because it's stigmatized. So how do you undo the stigma? I think that maybe you will need to talk more with those.
Yeah, I'm looking at the our slow life.
Yeah.
Thank you for your answer.
Sure.
Hi, thank you so much, Nina. That was beautiful. My question has to do with like a little earlier in the presentation when you showed that quote from the newspaper. You know, said like Mitians or Muslim basically, where it referred to them all as Muslim. My question had to do with kind of, so I think the football club is a great example of you know, the Chilestinian community, right, trying kind of to defy lots of kind of prejudice and But then was there also some sort of pushback against homogenizing them as all the same? And it's not, I mean, hopefully there's like heartwarming good examples, but it's not always necessarily either like very positive, you know, historically like, oh, we're not Muslim or Christians like you, right? Or more recently, we didn't take the boat to Europe, right? Like we flew in. Anyway, is there like any, have you observed any sort of kind of resistance also towards the fact that they're all Muslim or they're all, you know?
Yes, actually, well, there's the question of Arab people Muslim, right? And they try to explain that they were not Muslim. But I think that for me, more interesting is that I went back to the census. I mean, these are all like public now, those old, so the census, right, all those, and I realized by reading through them, hundreds and hundreds of pages, that, how do you say, when you look at the groups of people, so the Turks were, in 1904, they were a majority. And then suddenly, in 1912, I can't remember the exact dates, the Turks were very few, and then the Egyptians appeared, and the Syrians appeared, and the Lebanese appeared. So while there was no nation called like that so early, they already had an affiliation to a place that was called like that, right? And they were beginning to distinguish themselves, especially distinguish themselves from Turks. So it's hard to tell who was asking the questions in the census and what kinds of questions were being asked. Because first they were all Turks, and then suddenly they started sort of appearing all these different groups of people. So it's super interesting. And they founded different social clubs, the Syrian social club, the Palestinian social club. So they made a difference between themselves, which is the opposite to what the British mandate was doing, right? Or the French. So that's the first distinction, trying to encapsulate the actual place that they came from, that made a distinction there. The distinction within the community between Christians and Muslims wasn't really there because the Muslims were so few, especially in the early days. What did happen is that later in the late 20th century, there were a group of people who came and they were Muslims, and there were actual differences in faith, belief, and kind of the others were already very Chilean. These were really not at all. They didn't speak Spanish, etc. So that created a little bit of tension. But I do think that the strength of the violence that the Palestinians are suffering is actually creating, and this is my claim, right? Unity no matter what. It's like that is the most important thing. And this is, I think, the same. I mean, I like to quote Butler, where she says about feminism and all the ways of feminism that we might disagree, but you don't have to be the friend of the people you march with. And you shouldn't forget who is the real danger. So you can have many differences, but all in all, we know who the enemy is, right? And so we're going to protect as much as possible that unity. And sorry, and let me just add one more thing. In the last March, I was amazed at the amount of Lebanese flags. Right? So it was a Palestinian march, and Lebanese are very few in Chile, Lebanese descendants, but still the flag was all over the place. So that sort of alliances occur as well.
Yes?
Thank you so much for your talk. It was really great to see iterations of identity, and it really just made me think of Edward Said and his whole claim, and it's interesting. I feel like your talk is almost like these psychological ink blots, and it's like the other side also affected by the British mandate and this like generalized colonial view of identity, and placing these markers on other, and then to see like the impacts of displacement, forces of the violence, and diaspora, and all the different eras and like the different markers of context. But still, this whole debate around identity and through the diaspora and where these indicators and markers of self-identity, unity, community, solidarity. It's just an interesting depth of that conversation. It kind of almost thinks of, basically the next step from Edward's side. So I guess I don't really have a question, just kind of making that connection of identity through the lens of the other versus the self.
Well, thank you so much for bringing up Edward Said's important contribution and really, what can I say, putting my name and his name together I'm speechless.
But the idea, you know, like, I don't know if those of you who haven't read Edward Said, he really talks about Orientalism as being this, like, of who, Orient of who, you know, and so then I'll, let's go.
So, I was in Chile this time last year, and we were in a study abroad program regarding human rights and dictatorship, and because of that, I became very interested in Israel's role in all the different Latin American dictatorships and the human rights violations and the trainings and the weapons that they provided. Does the awareness of Israel's role in the harms that were done to Chileans create more solidarity between the communities? In a sense, because they were kind of both.
Do you mean the Jewish and the Palestinian community?
I mean, like the Chilean and the Palestinian community, because the role that Israel played in Pinochet's dictatorship.
You know, that's a really, really interesting question in the sense that has been documented, right? Not only for Chile, but for most dictatorships. And there was a moment that the United States forbid the entry of arms from the United States, right? There was an embargo, and Israel took over, right? It became really, really important in the selling of weapons during the dictatorship, and that alliance has continued all the way up to a few years back when there was uprising in Chile, right? And the whole tactic of shooting the eyes of the citizenship is something that has been already explored in Palestine, right? And trained throughout the world, right? And that has been very making, and that is documented. But interestingly, that is not said in Chile. It was really hard for me to find the information because I wrote a book that had to do with blinding citizens, and I really used I read very productively Esmeir book on naming citizens, but it was really hard for me to find the actual. I mean, it's documented, but it's hard to find.
In the Human Rights Museum that's in Santiago, I noticed, and it was not on display or emphasized at all, but it was the English memos from the United States intelligence, and there was one where it was before the United States had public support, and then after when they pulled away their support. And in the beginning there's a memo where they're saying that there's human rights violations going on in Chile, and that they're doing this and this and this, and then the response to that memo is, well, it's no different than what's happening, what we're supporting Israel with Palestinians. So like that part to me, when I noticed that, I taken a picture of it. I use it in all my presentations and everything, because I just find that connection, why it's not a bigger deal is crazy to me, because
yes, but it's really not much discussed. As I said, it took me a while to find actual evidence that I could use, and still I was very careful with it, because it is said, but it's usually the military are quite close. It's not like they open up their archives for and when they do the declassification, which is horrendous because you can't read anything because everything is marked out, right? Everything you want to know, actually,
most of those.
so you don't know why it's called declassification. But anyway, so it's hard to look into that, but it's known, it's said, but people are not so aware. I think. I mean, that's a very good job you did with keeping that in mind.
was a wonderful talk, and it just opened up so many avenues that we could pursue. But, so, and I had two things that I just want to throw out. One, in this discussion of origins, there's almost an anxiety of mimicry, and I guess you're not thinking that old homie Bob Edison many years ago. There's a mimicry of the migrant to imagine life as it was, right? What was it in the old country? What should I look like? And right? And also the demands of mimicry in the new situation, right? How do I pass as a Chilean? I mean, I suppose mimicry is very tightly connected to passing, and then it brings up this question of origins. But then I was thinking, how do women control it? Obviously, you're a woman writing about it, but I was thinking of your family trajectory. I know, or we all know in this room, about your grandfather. We know about the men's tennis teams. We know about the men's soccer teams. What happens, I mean, and I know you've made your mark in the world of feminism. How do you talk about this in terms of the women, a feminist insertion in this conversation?
Okay, let's see what they do with trying to answer your question. So, let me see. So the question of mimicry, I don't know, mimicry sounds to me, and maybe this is wrong, but my English is not so good, and I know that the resonance of the words might be wrong, but it's like the negative of performativity. Could we say that?
Yeah, that's good.
Mimicry, you know, like, they're not real, they're not like completely well made, but isn't identity also like fiction? You know, in my family, the story went that we were a harem, and the Meruanes were a harem, and all these women, and all the oldies like to talk about these stories. And everybody laughed, and then they would dress, and they would use the bañuelo, and they would sort of do this performance, but they knew that this was all fake, but at the same time it felt like things were a little real. So the mimicry and the performance for me are a little bit conectado, right? There's a little bit of theater, which makes you feel good. At the same time, I remember I got a recognition from the Palestinian Center, and somebody came up to me and she said, I can bring you a dress, a Palestinian dress to wear, like a traditional Palestinian dress. And I said, I can't do that, that's not the way I dress, right? So, but there's always like this thing about trying to perform as a Palestinian and knowing at the same time that you can't, because you don't carry all that baggage. You don't dress that way. You're not that person, right? So I think that there's always this tension between the mimicry. I don't know how to explain it, but uno está siempre como un poco ahí en ese borde, ¿no? Of trying to be but knowing you can't, so you kind of play around it. And you make jokes, and you dress up, and you undress, and you wear the pañuelo, and you take it off, etc. I do my own mimicry when I'm in Palestine. I usually cover my head in specific places. And that's my own sort of mimicry or performance. Performance is more political. It has it's a better word in terms of its prestige. And then the feminist part. I don't know what to say because I didn't get to know my grandmother on the Palestinian side. But what I do know and what I very much respect about her is that she insisted very much in the education of my father and my aunts. Because my grandfather wanted my father to inherit his store, his textile store. Right? And my grandmother said, no way. The only time she said no to something was about the education of my father and my aunts. She wanted them all to go to university because she had not had the opportunity to study. So when I think about my grandmother, the only thing I really know about her, and the thing I celebrate about her, is her wise stance on education. And the fact that she would have wanted the education she couldn't get because she didn't come from from a sort of economically well-built family. I also want to say that in the Palestinian community, a lot of women are educated. It is not what people really think. I mean, and in general, from the Arab world, a lot of women, I mean, I've been to so many universities in Palestine, so many well-educated women, right? So this idea that we have of maybe Afghanistan and of the Islamists not allowing the women to be educated is really not the case. At least not the case that I have seen in Palestine and the West Bank. And my grandmother couldn't get education, but she did interest herself in that. And then my other side, my mother's side, is a very different kind of family. The female there are very strong. So my mother had to educate my father a little bit in feminism. But you know, I don't know.
Open spaces.
Yes, yeah. I mean, my grandmother was a typical grandmother, that Palestinian one, at the same time was very aware of what needed to be done.
I think we're going to wrap it up. As we all exit, I'm sure Lina might, I'm assuming Lina might be okay with anyone who wants to come and ask you a last question, but so we start wrapping up the room, primarily for the staff that have been here supporting us, so that they can go home. Before we give Lina a round of applause, I want to remind you all about the donation campaign, right? For the Middle East Children's Alliance. That emergency, there's a QR code, there's some of them are here, I think there's some in the back. There's the person running this campaign is sitting in the back, so if anyone wants any donation, no matter how small, is useful. So here is the information, back there's the person, and thank you so much.